Your badge still says intern in red letters across the bottom. You've had this job for 11 weeks. You make coffee runs on Tuesdays because it's your turn in the rotation, and nobody's updated the spreadsheet to remove you from it. And 40 minutes ago, in a conference room you weren't technically invited into, the founders signed paperwork confirming that the company you fetch lattes for just sold for $85 million. You weren't in the room. You found out from a Slack message. And somewhere buried in the fine print of an equity agreement you signed on day one, half reading it because you needed the internship credit for graduation, there's a clause that includes you. Not generously, not symbolically. Actually, mathematically, undeniably includes you. This isn't about luck, even though it looks exactly like luck from the outside. It's a story about what happens when a system designed to reward risk accidentally rewards someone who barely understood the risk they were taking. You didn't found this company. You didn't raise the funding. You didn't sleep on the office floor during the 18-month stretch when payroll almost didn't clear. You showed up 11 weeks ago, learned how to use the internal ticketing software, and got handed a stock grant so small that the recruiter mentioned it almost as an afterthought, buried between dental coverage and the parking situation. And that afterthought just turned into more money than anyone in your family has accumulated across 3 generations combined. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how an intern ends up inside a deal this size. What actually happens in the hours and days after a number like that becomes real, and why the version of you walking out of this building tonight will spend years figuring out what this moment actually meant. Chapter 1: The Grant Nobody Explained Properly. 11 weeks ago, you sat across from an HR coordinator who slid a packet across the table and said the word equity the way someone mentions a minor perk, somewhere between the free snacks and the flexible dress code. You signed it. Not because you understood vesting schedules or dilution or liquidation preferences. You signed it because everyone else in your cohort was signing an identical packet, and asking too many questions felt like it might make you look unprepared for a job you desperately wanted. The number on the page was small. Genuinely small. A fraction of a percent, vesting over a schedule you didn't fully track, contingent on a future event that felt, at the time, entirely hypothetical. Startups don't usually sell. Everyone knows this. The vast majority of them either fold quietly or limp along for years without a dramatic exit. The equity conversation happens because legally it has to happen, not because anyone genuinely expects the hypothetical to become real. You filed the packet away, both literally and mentally, and went back to learning the ticketing software. What you didn't fully grasp, what almost nobody explains clearly to interns because there's rarely a reason to, is that equity grants aren't measured by your title. They're measured by timing. You joined during a specific window, a window that happened to sit just before an acquisition conversation that had already, unbeknownst to you, been quietly progressing for months at a level several floors above your desk. The size of your slice was small. The size of the pie turned out to be enormous. And multiplication doesn't care how junior you are. Chapter 2: The Months You Didn't Know Anything Was Happening. For most of your internship, the acquisition conversation existed entirely above your visibility, the way weather systems form over an ocean long before anyone on shore notices the sky changing. You noticed small things without understanding what they meant. The CEO started disappearing into calendar blocks labeled with vague, generic titles. A handful of unfamiliar visitors came through the office wearing sharper suits than anyone who normally worked there, escorted directly into the largest conference room, the one with the door that actually closed all the way. Your manager seemed distracted during a few one-on-ones, answering your questions a beat too slowly, like part of her attention was permanently parked somewhere else. None of this registered as significant. Companies have visitors, executives have private meetings. You were an intern, and your entire frame of reference for normal office behavior was built on 11 weeks of data, which is nowhere near enough to detect an anomaly this large hiding inside the ordinary texture of a workday. You kept making the coffee run every Tuesday. You kept closing tickets, learning the code base, asking the kinds of earnest questions that interns ask. the ones senior engineers answer with a patience that borders on parental. Meanwhile, in rooms you never entered, lawyers were drafting terms, due diligence teams were combing through financial records, and a number was slowly crystallizing that would eventually, almost as an accident of arithmetic, include your name on a distribution schedule. Chapter 3. The day the Slack message arrived. The message came at 2:47 in the afternoon in the general company channel from the CEO's account. It opened with an emoji, which felt, in retrospect, like an almost comically small container for the actual content that followed. The company had been acquired. The acquiring company's name meant something to you. The way certain names in your industry mean something to anyone who's paid even casual attention, and reading it attached to your own workplace produced a strange vertigo, like watching two unrelated parts of your life suddenly impossibly overlap. The message continued with logistics. A company-wide meeting scheduled for the following morning. A note about equity holders receiving individual outreach from the finance team within the week. A thank you paragraph. Warm and slightly formal. The kind of writing that had clearly been drafted and revised several times before being sent. You read the word equity holders 3 separate times before your brain fully connected it to yourself. Because in your mental model, equity holders were founders. Equity holders were the early engineers who'd been there since the beginning, the ones with framed photos of the original 3-person team taped above their monitors. You were an intern. You made coffee on Tuesdays. But the packet you signed 11 weeks earlier had used a specific, unambiguous, legally binding word, and that word was now doing exactly what it was designed to do, regardless of how long you'd actually been in the building. Chapter 4. The waiting period nobody prepares you for. Here's something almost nobody talks about when they imagine what a windfall like this feels like. There's a gap, sometimes measured in days, sometimes in weeks, between finding out something enormous has happened and actually understanding what it means for you specifically. The company-wide meeting the next morning was mostly logistics, mostly reassurance about job continuity, mostly answering questions from senior staff who had genuine, practical concerns about titles and reporting structures under the new parent company. Nobody in that meeting addressed the size of an intern's equity grant, because that conversation, understandably, wasn't happening in a room with 60 people in it. You spent the following 4 days in a strange limbo, doing your actual job, closing your actual tickets, while carrying a private, unverified hypothesis that something significant might apply to you without any confirmation of exactly how significant or whether you'd misread the situation entirely. You did the math yourself, more than once, on a notepad, then on a calculator app, then on a spreadsheet you built specifically for this purpose, and then deleted out of a strange embarrassment as though someone might see it and accuse you of counting money that wasn't actually yours yet. The number you calculated seemed too large to be real. You assumed you'd made an error somewhere. A misunderstanding of vesting percentages, a miscalculation of the acquisition multiple, some detail in the fine print that would deflate the number back down to something proportionate to your actual contribution. The finance team's email arrived on the 5th day. The number in that email matched your spreadsheet almost exactly. Chapter 5. The specific discomfort of disproportionate reward. It's about what the money reveals when you set it next to your actual contribution. The senior engineer 3 desks away from you had been at the company for 4 years. She'd rewritten the core infrastructure twice. She'd worked weekends during the crisis period when payroll almost failed to clear. Her equity grant, proportionally larger than yours in raw percentage terms, still didn't produce a number that felt, to you, adequately larger than what you'd received for 11 weeks of coffee runs and ticket closing. You didn't cause this discrepancy. The math simply worked the way equity math works, rewarding timing and structure rather than raw effort. And you happen to occupy a specific slot in that structure at a specific moment. But understanding the mechanism intellectually didn't fully dissolve the discomfort of it emotionally. You found yourself avoiding eye contact with colleagues who'd been there for years, not because anyone said anything unkind, but because you were preemptively bracing for a resentment that, for the most part, never actually arrived. Most of your coworkers were genuinely happy for you, or at minimum, professionally gracious about it, because they understood the mechanism too. Everyone in a startup signs the same kind of packet. Everyone understands, at least abstractly, that timing occasionally produces outcomes that don't map neatly onto tenure or effort. But a small number of interactions did carry an edge, a joke that landed slightly too pointed, a congratulations that arrived a beat too flat. You couldn't always tell whether you were imagining the tension or accurately detecting it. And that specific uncertainty, the inability to fully trust your own read on social dynamics during a moment. This loaded turned out to be one of the more exhausting parts of the entire experience. Chapter 6: The Practical Chaos of Suddenly Having the Number. There were multiple rounds of paperwork. A vesting cliff you had technically already cleared, but which still required documentation. A tax structure you didn't understand at all, involving terms like qualified small business stock and holding periods, concepts that existed nowhere in your prior financial vocabulary because nothing in your life until this point had required them. You hired a financial advisor for the first time in your life, an experience that felt oddly formal for someone who, 3 months earlier, had been splitting grocery bills with roommates and tracking expenses in a free budgeting app. The advisor asked questions you'd never considered. Questions about risk tolerance, about time horizon, about whether you intended to use any portion of this for a home purchase in the near term. You answered most of them with some version of, I haven't thought about that yet, because you genuinely hadn't. 11 weeks ago, you were worried about whether your internship would convert into a full-time offer. Now you were being asked to make decisions that would shape decades of your financial life, and the whiplash between those two realities was, frankly, disorienting. The money didn't arrive all at once either, which surprised you. It moved through several tranches, several confirmations, several moments where you refreshed a banking app compulsively, checking whether the transfer had actually processed, half expecting an error message informing you that some clerical mistake had been discovered and the whole thing was being reversed. It wasn't reversed. The number stayed. Chapter 7: What you actually did with the first few weeks. Contrary to what you might expect, the first few weeks after the money cleared were almost aggressively unremarkable. You didn't buy anything significant, partly because the advisor had explicitly recommended against major purchases in the immediate aftermath of a windfall, citing a well-documented pattern of decision fatigue producing poor choices during exactly this kind of emotional spike. Partly because you genuinely didn't know what you wanted yet, having spent your entire adult life planning around a completely different financial ceiling than the one you now operated under. You kept showing up to work, in fact, because the acquiring company had extended full-time offers to most of the original team, internship included, and you accepted yours largely out of inertia and a genuine curiosity about what came next professionally, separate entirely from the financial question. Your coworkers, for the most part, adjusted faster than you expected. The initial strangeness of the situation faded within a month or so, replaced by a new normal where the topic simply wasn't discussed much, partly out of politeness, partly because everyone had their own version of processing the same event, just at wildly different magnitudes. You told your parents on a phone call that lasted considerably longer than any phone call you'd had with them in years, mostly because they kept asking you to repeat the number, convinced they'd misheard it the first 3 times. Your mother cried briefly, not from sadness, but from a kind of disbelief that seemed to require physical release. Your father asked almost immediately what your plan was, a question you didn't have a satisfying answer to yet, and one that would continue not having a satisfying answer for considerably longer than either of you expected. Chapter 8: The Realization That Changed How You Understood the Whole Thing. Somewhere around the 2-month mark, sitting in the same office, doing largely the same work, you had a realization that reframed the entire experience. The money wasn't a reward for what you'd done, it was a reward for a decision you'd made 11 weeks earlier without fully understanding its implications. The decision to take an uncertain internship at an early-stage company instead of a safer, more established alternative that had also been available to you at the time. You'd chosen the riskier option, not out of financial calculation, but because the work seemed genuinely more interesting, the team seemed sharper, and the vague promise of equity felt, at the time, like an abstract bonus rather than a meaningful factor in your decision. That choice, made for reasons that had nothing to do with money, turned out to be the actual mechanism behind the entire outcome. This reframing mattered because it shifted the story away from luck alone and towards something slightly more complicated. A genuine risk had been taken, even if you hadn't consciously registered it as a risk at the time. And the outcome of that risk, however disproportionate it felt relative to your tenure, was still, technically, the result of a real decision rather than pure chance. You didn't control the timing of the acquisition, but you did control the decision to be in that specific room, on that specific team, during that specific window, instead of somewhere safer. Chapter 9. What this experience actually taught you about money. Here's what you've come to understand in the months since. Turning this over repeatedly. Trying to extract something useful from an experience that initially felt almost too strange to learn anything coherent from. Money that arrives disproportionate to effort creates a specific, uncomfortable psychological task. The task of reconciling your self-concept with an outcome your self-concept wasn't built to accommodate. You'd spent your entire life understanding yourself as someone who worked steadily toward modest, earned outcomes. This experience didn't fit that framework, and you spent considerable time trying to force it into a narrative where you'd somehow earned this proportionally, a narrative that, examined honestly, simply didn't hold up. The more useful reframe, the one that eventually stuck, was recognizing that fairness and mechanism are two entirely separate questions. The mechanism was clear. Equity structures reward whoever holds shares when a liquidity event occurs, regardless of tenure. Whether that mechanism is fair in some broader philosophical sense is a genuinely interesting question, but it's a different question entirely from understanding how the outcome actually happened. Separating those two questions let you stop trying to justify the outcome morally and start simply working with the practical reality of what you now had. You also learned something about the specific loneliness of disproportionate financial outcomes. Nobody in your life had a comparable frame of reference for what you were experiencing, which meant most conversations about it felt slightly performative on both sides. You downplaying the scale to avoid seeming boastful, others responding with a mixture of genuine happiness and a kind of distance that seemed to emerge naturally whenever the topic surfaced. A year later, your badge no longer says intern. You have a proper title now, one that reflects the full-time role you eventually settled into, doing work that has almost nothing to do with the number sitting quietly in your accounts. The Tuesday coffee rotation still exists, somehow, an oddly persistent office ritual that outlasted the entire acquisition, though you're no longer on it. You still think, occasionally, about the version of yourself who sat across from that HR coordinator 11 weeks into an internship, half reading a packet he barely understood, signing something because everyone else in the room was signing it too. That version of you had no idea what was coming. Not because he was naive exactly, but because nobody reasonably expects the hypothetical scenario buried in the fine print to become the actual scenario of their life. You've stopped trying to fully reconcile whether you deserved this outcome because you've come to understand that deserving isn't really the right lens for understanding how equity, timing, and risk actually interact. What you do know is this. The version of you who took the uncertain internship instead of the safer alternative made a decision that mattered enormously, even though the reasons behind that decision had nothing to do with the outcome that eventually followed. Sometimes the thing that changes your entire life isn't the moment everyone else notices. It's the quiet, unremarkable decision made 11 weeks earlier that nobody, including you, thought was significant at the time.